All right, we're live, ready to go. Next series in our AI Master Series, the future of data security. And really excited to have my friend Mike Noonschwander here from Tech Vision Research to have this incredible conversation about I don't even know, it's been like maybe a month ago. It seems like forever, Mike. I feel like we're old friends at this point. Seriously, we've had so many great conversations. But we met at an AI conference and started a discussion on just the work that I'm doing in AI business transformation and training, and then his work in identity and security. And we realized we have this very common career path, which was really fun to make those connections. Starting back 30 years ago, do I dare say it, Mike?
Yeah.
At Novell, I was a network engineer, and you were in the directory identity space, good old DirectXML, right?
That's
Um,
yeah.
and then into Oracle, some time there as well, which I had a couple stints at Oracle myself, and so we've just have this really fun career pathway that's been in parallel in many ways in enterprise software delivery, and so as we got talking more and more, we realized there's this huge need for educating individuals in security, because the first thing that I'm always dealing with when I shouldn't say dealing, but approaching with businesses and individuals is the fear of AI, right? And as well as the complexity of some of the terminology and what does this mean and how does this apply to me. We want to be able to really kind of demystify this security concern and also be real about it, because there are concerns, right? And things we want to do. So to kick things off, first of all, I'm going to have Mike introduce himself. He'll do a far better job than I will at this. So, Mike, if you want to take a few minutes and just give your high level background.
Yeah. Thanks, Trina. And it was great to meet you. And suddenly we realized we had almost all of our friends in common,
Yes.
except for ourselves. Yes, it's true. I started out in doing product management and identity management at Novell, and ended up being at Burton Group, which is now part of Gartner, uh, as the research director there for identity and privacy strategies. And then since then, I've moved on in various roles from product management to consulting for enterprise companies, with Accenture, for example, and a company that was acquired by UI. And so I've been involved quite heavily in the deployment and development of enterprise grade identity security type solutions. And as AI came along, I realized that this was a similar problem to identity in the sense that it had so much to do with society, really. And
Right.
that's why I ended up founding a group just recently that I call AI for Society Online. And we'll
Mhm.
talk about that some more a little bit later.
Yeah, that'll be exciting. I mean, both sides of both from a business practitioner as well as the societal impacts and bringing all minds together. We're going to dig into that a little bit today. So excited for a lot of that discussion, but really want to dig in and start to have these conversations on how do we start embracing AI for influence, right? What are some of the approaches and things that you're seeing in industry and from your perspective that need to be considered? And so maybe we just start there, Mike, and start digging in.
Yeah, I agree. So we have a couple of bullet points here. They all kind of belong together. The idea is that with AI, we're confronted not just with a turning of the crank in some level, but we really do find ourselves in novel circumstances. In that so many of the assumptions, especially around security and identity, that we have built into enterprise and other sort of organizational patterns, have are completely uprooted. One
Mhm.
of the more obvious ones is just that this idea of determinism. When we think about a normal security policy, when I say normal, what's normal today, is that we look for a specific pattern that is and we can deterministically say if this particular event happens or a series of events happen, then there's an easy sort of mathematical computation you can do to say, all right, either shut it off,
Right.
notify. There are some very specific actions that can be taken as a result of something that's very specific. When we get into AI, that approach just goes out the window.
Yeah. And why is that? What is it that AI is introducing that's completely disrupting that?
Well,
Maybe.
first of all, as the LLMs that we're using primarily now, which are just a portion of, let's face it, of the overall AI field, LLMs are, as I mentioned, a language model, and there's a lot of nuance. And there's, of course, really what it's trying to do is just really understanding the language of a situation, and not per se the exact sort of signals that come out normally of, say, a firewall or something.
Right.
Or
It's easily detectable, right? Because it is so nuanced, it's hard to identify when and where that might be a risk.
Right. Yeah. So there's really two sides of that coin. One is trying to use a large language model for something like a security policy, which is kind of what I was alluding to there, but also the security of the model itself. So if we are prompting things into the model, there are ways that really almost anything in that prompt and response interaction can leak into public domain and other places.
Right.
So we need to look at data security as well in a much different way. That doesn't happen, for example, in your data center. And when you get security alerts, those are pretty well protected. Okay, no one's going to go find out about those because of the protections you put in place. But if you're using a large language model to try to do detection of some security event, those could potentially be compromised.
I see. And one of the things that as we start doing consulting and engagements with businesses, there's a fear of even starting, right? Because of this lack of understanding. Well, how do I protect myself then if I am using a large language model to make sure that our private information is not leaked out to the world? And anywhere from small business to enterprise, those are great questions to ask. As far as a lot of the coaching we'll do is, like, let's say you're using a ChatGPT, learning how to turn off the, just individual usage in there of saying, okay, do not train off my data. First of all, everybody that's using ChatGPT needs to be doing that today, right? Because otherwise you could have personal information, other things being leaked out. So, I mean, that's one. But on the business side of it, I've also seen a lot of businesses saying, well, because we just don't understand this, we're just going to tell our employees don't use it. But what ends up happening are individuals are using it. Whether you're saying use it or not, they're seeing the productivity gains for their day-to-day job. So they're using it without any training. And that's a bigger risk. If you're just kind of like a no-go type approach, you're actually exposed. And I think it's better to get in and start training on these differences and nuances, right? And the differences that are happening, rather than just saying, okay, we're going to opt out for now until we understand this better. Because you're just going to have employees using it at this point.
There's really no sand to stick anybody's head in.
Yeah.
There's unfortunately, people are using AI whether they know it or not. They have been for years. So understanding the technology is really what becomes very important. It's also important to understand in my industry, in the sort of security and identity industry, we talk about zero trust. That's like a big term right now. And zero trust. I hate that sort of that the security people have co-opted that term trust. I'd like to redefine that maybe even on today's call. But the idea is that that applies in some ways to AI, but semantically different, which is that if you're using AI, which we all are, you probably have zero trust that any of that data is going to be. I'm not going to train on it. Sure.
Yeah.
But in addition, there's other ways to lose data. Then even if they're not training on your data, all of your prompts and responses are available in audit logs. And these logs are available to anybody that builds an application. So if you're using what we call a RAG application, anybody with access to those logs can see exactly what you're doing. Right?
Yeah.
So
on the back end, being able to have that exposed, what are they? That's another point. Not just what you're putting out to the wide world, but internal protections and provisioning access controls need to be put in place.
So
and considered
your
as
point, I think it's important not to become scared of this, but just to make sure that you're taking the proper precautions.
Right. And I think that's the goal for today, is to go through knowledge. You can remove some of the fears, right? Of, well, what do I need to consider? And we're going to dig into some of these more. I wanted to share a story real quick, because I think that this idea that it's someone else that's going to address these. I want everybody that's listening and watching this to go, it's not somebody else, it's you. Because probably a year ago, with the nonprofit I run at Tech Moms, we started doing AI certification training and upskilling our students in AI. And we were doing a certification program. And at the end of it, we had an open mic and they were asking questions. And one of the alumni stood up and said, well, there's all these trust and hacking and all these bad actors, if you will, right, that are out there doing things that are going to challenge these security and identity concerns. And she said, so who's going to address this? And I stood up and I said, well, that's why you're here. Who's going to be the good actor if not you? And instead of taking a mindset approach of just leaning in and learning some of these concepts, removing some of the fear, and taking a more proactive approach, introducing more good actors into this rather than just the bad actors that are taking advantage of it faster than the good actors are probably coming on board. And so I think that's why, as I put this webinar series together, is just creating that awareness of, like, we all have a part in this, and really starting to embrace and understand it so that we can put those protections in place. So with that, moving into this next section on business-driven maturity, right? Like, use cases, every company is going to be different on how they adopt AI and where they should adopt. And so can you share a little bit more on your experience of where, as companies start leaning in, what they should be considering, and kind of this use case guide?
Yeah, there have been a number of kind of studies done in this area, and really it's mixed. I think I understand some of the reason for that. There's kind of a top-down and bottom-up a difference in these use cases. In some cases, when the C-suite, somebody from the executive ranks comes and says, "Look, we need more. We want AI to perform business critical functions for us, or to improve our accuracy or speed or whatever it may be," then oftentimes there's usually like some governance body already established, and you have quite a bit of funding going into some things like that. Mm-hmm. Now, I was on a conference last week, in fact, where a couple of the speakers there say that they went about it that way, and they found that they were getting roughly 50% success rate, meaning that about 50% of over 1,000 use cases that they implemented were let's look at the half empty first, which means that they were almost completely useless to them.
Right.
But on the other hand, they were finding some very good business critical use cases that were very useful, and they were moving forward with. So yeah, there is a bit of throwaway here, but that certainly wasn't significant enough to make them to discourage them from going forward. But they had to rapidly iterate on that to understand if it was going to work and what wasn't. Now, on the other hand, there was another speaker at that same conference that spoke about his research into the top 100 use cases for AI at the moment. Mm-hmm. And now he got his data primarily from sources such as Reddit and other things, right? So these are probably stands to reason in this way, but the top 10 were things like help me write an email, right?
I mean, those are just the low-hanging fruit right now. Right.
And personal productivity by and large, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Not necessarily organizational, what I call organizational AI, which is, I think, really what we're here to talk about today, which is the organizational use cases. And in that vein, I think it is important to understand, and this gets into the long haul proof of concept idea. There's in the last month or so, which is an eon, right, in AI terms. There's been a lot of talk about how AI is stalling, that they're running out of training data, and that things aren't just getting any better. AGI is this far away, and so there's a lot of that sort of thing going on. that's great. That's like academia. Okay. In the enterprise, what we're finding is that almost all of the use cases that are being put out there are largely in proof of concept. Right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a slower, the development of the technologies. It's still the predominantly faster than the ability to adopt, right? And even what we're seeing is that companies at all levels are figuring out how to adopt the technologies the best way. And the shift that I'm seeing is that being able to embrace this pace, because it is getting faster, and the demands are getting faster on how can you pace this AI integration into your workforce. It's not just the technology, and that's a lot of what we've been consulting on, is it's the change management, right, that needs to happen in order to adopt these new technologies. Just like any enterprise deployment I've ever done throughout my 30-year career, we still had to work on the change management side of this, and take into compliance and security and identity, all of these things. It's a shift in how we oversee our processes and integrate AI into our current processes, right? So there's this shift happening both from a technology standpoint, addressing the fears. There's some emotional intelligence pieces in there on how to approach that, as well as the leadership through it. And that's the challenge, I think, is pulling all three of the people, process, and tools all together as we're going through this massive shift right now.
Yeah, from everyone that I've talked to or listened to, change management is the thing that is, if you want to call it stalling, is stalling the proof of concept. I believe that as soon as we get past that, which is certainly going to take some time, then we get into sort of data management and data security issues that will also require a lot more from an organization to before they can really go into production with a lot of these business critical use cases.
Yeah, it just pushes the more of an emphasis again on those agile frameworks, and breaking it down into bite-sized consumable pieces that you can start moving through without, because to your earlier point, like by the time you get something in, it's completely different. And so how do you create a more flexible and fluid environment that can deal with ambiguity, move through these massive change processes? It takes quite a bit of reskilling prior leadership approaches to what's happening.
Just one point there. I know that when you're in a POC, a lot of times what will happen is that you'll use the best, most productive model. And this is probably a good idea. You're just trying to prove out the concept, right? So you're using, the best frontier models and that sort of thing. But when you go to production, you swap it out with something that's a little cheaper and possibly older and maybe even more narrow. And configuration management, in addition to change management, can be very difficult because, to your point, it's not something like you're doing a lot of your early testing on a model that you won't be using in production.
Right.
Those models can change anytime, and you don't know exactly how that's going, what the outcome will be when you switch to a new model, and how do you test and regression test. And these sorts of things. So it's very difficult for people to get their mindset away from, and it is a mindset issue, right? When we're thinking about coding something in Java versus having good portions of the application using an LLM as its sort of thought layer, then it requires a less deterministic and more probabilistic approach.
Yeah, and I think that takes us into like our next topic area on this idea of enterprise requirements, what they're looking for versus the AI limitations right now. And you mentioned to me while we're speaking, and I'm like, this is this goes into that mindset shift, right? It's not about control anymore. It's about risk mitigation going forward. Because you can't say this is what it's going to be. We're in this really fast-paced environment that you've got to kind of change that mindset. So maybe talk a little bit about this idea of accountability, security, and visibility, and your background in this space.
Right. This kind of gets to the crux of the matter. It's not just about code. We've been talking about how our mentality, based on programmatic programming is sort of we've trained our minds to think in some sort of logical format. But really, what it comes down to are some of the legal and social issues. For example, when we look at security frameworks, it's important to think about things like accountability. So Sarbanes-Oxley and some of the things that have come afterwards, right, around financial regulations, really need to know, for example, not just who has access to what, but who could potentially gain access to something, or who are all the people that we are entrusted with a certain set of keys. And they need that to tie back to a physical person, right? So if now we're doing anything regulatory that where an AI makes a decision, or an agent, right, an AI agent, or the agentic layer as we're calling it now, apparently. If something in there makes a decision, there's a couple of problems here. We don't really know who's accountable for that. We don't know why that particular decision was made. We can't really reverse it. There's a couple of difficulties, even just in this accountability idea. Is an agent an actual identity? Is it a thing, right? And that's thoughts that go deeper on that, but we don't have to do that here.
Right now. But I think that the idea, like, even if you take like the work going on right now for driverless cars, like who's making the decision, right? It's that accountability of if we had an exercise when I was in classes at MIT on AI product design, and we were talking about this accountability, right? And how you define the policies. And they had us use this kind of tool where it was saying, okay, if you see a dog or a person, do you hit the dog or the person? And then if something like that happens, or if you have an older person and a younger person who, it's these really kind of ethical discussions, right? And then if that does happen, who's held accountable for that? Is it the driver that was sitting in the car even though they weren't driving, or is it the software that was created, or is it the person that created? Like, these are really complicated discussions on accountability that are happening.
Not just academic. Waymo ended up in San Francisco a few months back with a fatal accident that was partly because of a situation like you described, where the AI got confused. And of course, the liability, of course, goes back to the owner and the operator, so Waymo, right? But there are so many of these kinds of actions that are happening at scale all the time that the legal system is not really the way to kind of think about trying to solve all of these issues.
Right. And even as in a company that's starting to adopt AI, you can like put this even on a smaller scale, like a chat bot that's guiding, right? Like what thinking about the risk mitigation, going back to about, it's not the control, it's about what may or may not, you've got to think through all those scenarios, which of what could be a potential risk in the output you're creating.
I encourage everybody. I tend to have fun with this. In fact, I just did this before I was on a website. It popped up one of those little chat things that I find really annoying sometimes. But I thought, okay, I'm going to give this a try, and it totally went down the wrong direction. It was embarrassing. I think it's like, wow, who trained this thing? Like, so I went back to the company's site and did a regular search, and it went fine, right? So that was all okay. But rectifying like how these two worlds between kind of the programmatic world that we are aware of today and kind of where LLMs are taking us, and where AI in general is taking us, that's a train that unfortunately you're going to have to board right away, because this mode of thinking will become the dominant mode of thinking.
Yes, and so it's these new mindsets of always curious, always questioning. That's what I guide a lot of my clients to, is like, we've got to shift them. It's that mindset shift we're happening. How do we now become curious, learning about accountability and security and visibility and identity, like, and then starting to question, like, is this the right thing? And bringing everybody into it. And everybody on this call, like I said at the beginning, your role is you have a role in this. And companies that start to engage their employee base in upskilling on AI and getting familiar and learning these things are going to have far more of these things identified, because they're closer to the issues. They're going to be able to identify these risks. And so you have to have a really good feedback communication cycle in order to support this, right? In all sizes of organizations, making sure that you're talking through and having these conversations or having a feedback loop, and use AI to be able to help you sort through all of that. Especially if you're in a large organization, trying to identify where those risks might be, and leverage your employees to identify those.
Yeah, we mentioned here that like in the Security Operations Center in the SOC, SOC analysts are trained to sort of understand how to look for certain types of intrusion and try to figure out where a kill chain is. And they have all their terminology. When there is such a thing as prompt injection now, it's like SQL injection only with prompting, right? So how does your Security Operations Center then figure out how to go after a prompt injection, right? Because something that you have to train people up on, understand like what is going on here, right? If somebody's out there using your your chatbot on your website and trying to basically get it to divulge corporate information, just based on hijacking essentially the model that you're using, right? Then how does the SOC handle something like that? And what's the kill chain for something like that? Sort of. So these are some training things that you really need to make sure are happening in your organization. I wanted to point out this other thing about visibility, which is that a lot of organizations are using applications that use LangChain, which is a popular way to basically do what we call RAG applications, where you're basically mirroring or using private information from your organization in addition to some model to produce something of unique value to your Well, again, as I mentioned earlier, if you're using Langsmith with that or any other kind of so Langsmith is the way that you look at your logs, your activity log, and so on. You can see every token that was ever generated. You can see every prompt, right? You encrypted. You can go get that later and stuff like that. So there are some very important training exercises and sort of architectural concerns that you need to think through when deploying these types of applications.
And so I know that we are at a very short time here. One of the things I wanted to call out is that we'll be sending out some further information on some of these things, because we're not going to be able to deep dive on all of these things, right? We're just trying to do a high level understanding of kind of the scope and breadth of what needs to be considered for you. So even though we were not going to be able to dig deep into that, Mike has offered to provide some of that information. We're going to give a QR code at the end. We're going to, so you can actually get time with Mike, some of those things, so stick with us for a little bit. But always know that there's resources there and guidance to be able to help through as you dig through some of these considerations as we move through them. So let's move forward now, talking about industry responsibility and regulation. And so maybe you can give kind of this high level. Like I said, these are all really complicated deep dive things, but I want to at least give an overview from your perspective on, the responsibility and regulation considerations that everybody should be aware of as we start to dig into these concepts.
Yeah, I think that there's been a lot made in the press about regulation, and in some cases it's kind of portrayed as it's here to save the day. It's like once we get the regulation figured out, then we're all going to be safe. Yeah. That's not really what the regulators are trying to do, first of all. I mean, and right. Certainly the influences on them. Regulators are, thinking about when they talk about safety, they're very concerned about things like make sure you can't produce bioweapons and nuclear weapons and things like right. that. They're not thinking about a person's day-to-day safety necessarily. Sure, they think a little bit about privacy, but everybody thinks about privacy in today's age. And yeah, I'd like to explain a few things. So really, we have to be a little bit, regulation is slow to get produced. Normally, as you mentioned, Trina, with the car scenarios, we're mainly with legislation trying to figure out who's responsible for what, and it's not the regulation, in addition, is largely being influenced by the people who are creating these systems, right?
Yeah.
And not by the people using them, right?
And I think that's why we need everybody involved again, right? It just goes back to how much more important it is for everybody to be aware of these things and getting involved, because who's making the decisions are those that are closest to the regulars or maybe influencers. But, as a society, the more we understand these things, the more influence we can have in reaching out, and being part of that, and participating in it. Can you talk a little bit more on these self-policing limitations?
Yeah, there's a couple things to say about this one. I think that, of course, benchmarks are useful. We hear a lot about benchmarks in the news.
Mhm.
And, really, it's kind of funny that a bunch of academics would, create models that essentially play to their own tests. Right? So
Yeah.
it's like you can imagine a bunch of PhDs out there and saying, "This is what's going to be on the test," so you better
Yeah.
study. So they create these models that basically do well on their own benchmarks. Okay, so
Yeah.
great, but they're also doing that with state regulation and national regulation, international regulation. They're basically making it such that the AI models that we know perform very well on the tests that have been created. Okay, so we're trying to get away from that, and as an industry, there's a benchmark called the ARC test, which is, and there's the thing called the ARC prize, and it's $1 million for anybody who can actually publish in open source, publish a model or that can basically do abstraction and reasoning essentially, like an AGI would. So they test this by saying, I'm going to put something in front of the model that it can't have seen before, and the only way to basically understand or to get the answer correctly is through reasoning, right?
Yeah.
So we're getting close to that. Apparently, we talked about that a little bit.
Yeah, there was an announcement just this week from MIT saying we're on the verge of AGI, which they were projecting 2030, right? And I quickly, right before the webinar, so I haven't really read the whole article yet because it was like 3 minutes before we came on, but they had this article out there, and I was talking about this ARC benchmark that we're going to be talking about today. And I like the way they were, just from like a low level understanding, it was saying the ARC benchmark serves as an IQ test for machines. I think that's the best way to put it. Assessing the AI's ability to apply abstract reasoning to novel situations, and then marking a significant leap in reasoning capabilities. So it's kind of like the IQ for machines, and the standards that they've set for that.
Yeah, and I think that that's fascinating, of course. But again, it still goes back to the self-policing idea, which is that should we trust? And I wrote a blog post about this. It's on the AI for Society online site. We'll post it, of course. But
yes,
but should we really trust that just because we have AGI, we've achieved AGI, this thing can reason, and it has all this intelligence and everything. Are we sure it's going to be benevolent? Right? Are we sure that it's going to have any sort of compassion or anything, or any sort of social emotions? Right. So the problem is that you could create this massive intelligence and it can pass all these tests, but we don't know what kind of actor it's going to be in society, right? And so that's one of the reasons for the project I'm working on. Is I'm looking at, there needs to be some sort of external reality outside of the model that essentially is like the environment like that we live in. It's like we all have to obey the law of gravity.
Yeah, it puts those kind of controls and guardrails right in place,
exactly. And forces it externally from the model.
Right. And so I think we're going to talk about it a little bit, but I think this external trust mechanisms and new internet protocols, right? You were there. You've mentioned to me a couple of times that your involvement in some of the early IT standards and protocols early on. How is this different now?
Yeah, that's a good question. So it's true. The evolution of people on this call may be familiar with things like SAML, right? Security Assertion Markup Language, single sign-on, that kind of thing. We have quite a few things, like OpenID Connect is another thing, and OAuth. All of these things are things that were used very heavily today, but they came after quite a other approaches, and in some cases, an amalgam of those approaches over the course of 15 years or so of development. And the important part there that I wanted to bring up is, again, we're kind of beating on that drum of participation,
Right.
is that there were many things proposed. We had different types of architectures. I hate to call out Microsoft, but it's true. They for a while did not want to use the SAML protocol that was being developed, and but eventually they did come along. But why is that? Well, it's because people brought their own use cases. Like we once the industry, the developers of these technologies ended up encountering a significant number of people on the buying and using side, right? Their customers really drove them towards adoption of the things that would work in real life, right? And I think that we're in a similar scenario right now, to answer your question, which is that you really do need to sort of bring your own background, BYOB as it were, to AI, because we can't just leave this problem to thinkers at some university. I love Princeton, but come on, they're not running like a medical business. I know what they are. Let's think of a car business or something, right?
Yeah, the day-to-day, the use cases, and I love that BYOB terminology. Like, bring your own background. Like, we need everybody's background and involvement to really create the future decisions that impact us, and bring that voice forward into all of this. And I think that we're going to talk about some of the considerations that we have, but I know at the end of this, we're going to have a call to action of like how to do that, and start working with you. But before we get there, let's talk about some of these architectural considerations for security. I think this kind of goes more into the hands-on architecture side of it. What are some of the things that individuals should be considering from a data management, data segregation, some of these things that need to happen in order to make sure you've got a secure environment?
Right. So every organization has some kind of a tech stack, and hopefully you have that well defined. Normally you do in sort of in the cloud area. It gets a little more difficult if you're, say in hospitals and other places where it's maybe not so cleanly defined. But the idea is that you definitely want to have any sort of sensitive data or private data isolated, such that, as I mentioned before, that any of the logs or other kinds of things where people can access clear text information, that it's somewhere privatized. It's not going out to the model itself. It's if the model you're using is public. That you basically make sure that any private data remains so, and that's something that needs to be architected for directly into your tech stack.
Right.
Yeah.
And I think that even for a lot of founders of these AI companies, I mean, there's a lot of these coming up, asking the question and sharing how they've done this, I think builds trust, because things are coming on the market so fast, right? And are being adopted because you have the productivity benefits, but have they been evaluated for how are they using your data? What are those policies that they've implemented? Going back to that questioning mindset of, what, actually read how they're using your data, right? Just that's one thing everybody can do, is really understand how your personal identity and your information is being shared, or is it? And making sure you're selecting some of these platforms based on understanding of how they've isolated or not your data, whether it's an internal system you're building or the adoption and use of another system. Just need to be questioning on both sides of that.
Yeah, that reminds me, Trina, I was on a couple of consulting engagements way back when for Identity Federation to try to make it so you could single sign on into a bunch of different other businesses, right? So this is one I'm thinking of happened to be for a large insurance company. And you needed to log into one place and then get into a whole bunch of different other things, right? Well, I spent almost all of my time with lawyers, right? Not technicians. Right? They were trying to figure out the arrangements and contracts and look through the language of what agreements they could get in place. And it had almost nothing to do with technology. We knew the technology worked. No, it wasn't really a
It's
problem.
the legal and compliance traps you get caught in with some of this. You know, it's interesting as I was thinking about it because I have worked with some insurance companies as well, or any company that in their day-to-day productivity, are looking at AI because scanning a 144-page policy or scanning um, a document of any size, it just gets overwhelming. I don't have time to read this whole thing. Use AI to say, okay, tell me what the data privacy parts are of their policy. Just use it for that.
That's very effective, actually.
Yeah,
I've done that
because
a number of times.
use AI to make sure that you're understanding what the data privacy are considerations are before you adopt a platform or sign up for any SaaS service. Just scan their policy real quick and see what it is. I think that's just a good habit for anybody to get into.
I've done that with a number of even like when you look at a proof of concept, for example. And I'm sorry, not a proof of, when you ask companies for information about their product, sometimes they'll tell you some information through, say, a sales interaction or something. And sometimes it's also interesting to compare the information that they've sent you directly with what's publicly available,
Right.
to see if it's actually
Evaluating.
Yeah, you mentioned that because it's like if they tell you, if you get a contract that says that they won't train on your data, and then their public policy says that they do anyway, you might want to look for those discrepancies, for example.
Not that we shouldn't ever trust a salesperson, but
yeah, who would do
that? So what are we have had this conversation a little bit as well on the use of small language models for that being considered rather than a large language. You don't always need a large language model for everything, right? And so it goes back to that use case specialized application. So maybe you can share a little bit more of your perspectives on that.
I heard a really interesting quote that I had to write down, so I'm going to share this one with you. This is from Margaret Mitchell of Hugging Face. She said, "The future of AI is agentic and vertical." And by that, she meant that, and of course, Hugging Face is where where you get all of the models kind of dropped. It's a little bit like GitHub for AI, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so what they're seeing there and everywhere, and what I've been seeing generally is that people are starting to look at using the smaller versions of the large language models, or actually just plain small language models that were developed that way in the first place, to handle very specific task-based jobs, right, potentially even on the edge where they're not even connected to the internet, right, or in a space that's completely private where the data won't leave the device.
Yeah. Right. And I think that's a hugely valuable application. But it comes back to understanding what your use cases are. Mm-hmm. And it goes back to understanding your business strategy and what initiatives you're going to run and what's most important for the growth of your business, and that prioritization to be able to then make these decisions on what type of language model are we going to use. And then these, discussions on domain separation and how we're going to protect our data. What type of data would we have in there? Sometimes it's just research, so that's fine. We can use a large language for that. But if we're protecting our data, there's some very specific use cases that get that specialized version of a small language model.
Right. You mentioned domain separation. I think that what Margaret meant by vertical, which is to say that that you may have use cases that are specific to HR, but there's no reason to blend that with what's going on with IT. So if somebody's requesting a laptop or something, you don't necessarily need to know what their social security number is in that context, right? So it's important to make sure that the data domain separation is in place as well in your architecture. Right.
We do a lot of work on developing business strategy and leveraging AI to do that and pulling from all these data sources, right? And I think one of the areas that we discover as we go through this evaluation is that first, is your data available? I mean, you end up finding a lot of just core business process items as we try to implement an AI. There's a lot of data work that has to happen behind the scenes to be able to do AI. But once you do, can you pull in your employee sentiment data, your client sentiment data, your IT, information in order to determine your strategy and how you do that faster going forward? And so there's this domain separation, I think, is a brilliant idea. But at some point, you're going to want to bring it all together in some way to be able to look at it.
Right.
And that's powerful to be able to utilize the data you have on hand to make better decisions and make decisions faster in the future.
Yeah, that kind of introspection, let's call it. A lot of companies put a dashboard together to make sure that they're. The reason that I mentioned that statistic for in one case where 50% of the use cases essentially were failing or not doing their job. That's because there was a dashboard that they knew that, right? They understood.
They understood their data. Yeah.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, I think the visualization and tying that in to do budget and forecasting projections. Like there's just so many applications and there's so many viable applications, but how do we do it in a way that you're securing your organization as well? And that's the goal. Is not to say don't do it. It's how do we do this the right way and leverage it the right way and stay in compliance, right? So I know we actually titled this session on the future of AI models. And so we want to kind of give that future forward thinking, because I think everybody's trying to figure this out as we go right now. It's an incredible time, like one of the fastest changing. I mean, both of us have been in IT and tech for decades now. We've seen a lot of changes, right? But I think everybody, the pace of change is unreal. And we're all not sure where it's going to end up, right? And so I would love your perspective on this, on the future of AI models, and from your, background and experience, what you're seeing.
Well, such as it is, but I really, I would encourage people to take notice of what Yann LeCun has been doing. I think that he's been reminding people always. In fact, he's been known to say things like "LLMs suck." Right? Wait till you see what's coming. Right? There's like
just wait. Right? Yeah, we're just at the beginning.
And a lot of people in the AI field, I know, get offended when you equate LLMs with AI, because they feel like AI is such a much broader, more capable.
Is.
Right. So I think that we have to be a little bit careful here too, because with the excitement of AI and LLMs, there are a lot of vendors that are trying to drive towards a revenue capability. And part of the reason that I think it's appropriate that we're in the long haul sort of stall, right, of POCs is that sometimes the vendors are very aggressively trying to push these models onto business critical features when it's maybe not in the interest of the company to do so right away,
right?
And or at least not in the way that not so quickly. You're right. You might want to stop and think about some of the data issues that we've mentioned today. Right. So certainly today, LLMs, like you mentioned, dominate the landscape. But we are on the verge, some say as soon as 2025, right? Is sometime in 2025 when we'll have much better capabilities with AI. Either way, that's not, LLMs is still the on-ramp. Okay, so if you're going to be involved in AI, you need to start right now with LLMs. Okay?
Absolutely, yeah.
But I would say that what I would like to see is the future, and part of the reason I'm bringing my own background, right, to this, is, that I would like to see, okay, we are an online society now, meaning in the physical world, we are online, right?
Right.
There's no difference really between, we talk about modern society and all these different eras of society. We're in the online society right now, okay? And that means that there are all these other intelligences in our ecosystem with us, okay? And we need to therefore make sure that ecosystem doesn't just have physical properties. And this is where I step off a little bit from so Yann LeCun is talking a lot about how AI models need to have a worldview, essentially, right? A world model, he calls it, right? And I would like to think of that as so he's thinking of real world models. I'm thinking of, okay, what's the real world plus that online component, right? That's the online society now. It's the merger of these things. And what laws and properties and what other aspects of society are there to make sure that if you have like a completely agentic, right, lives only in the online portion of that society, how do you make sure that thing will behave? And that's what I would call trust. Okay, that's what I mean by trust.
That is trust. Yeah.
Right. It's something like, okay, how do you know you can trust this agent to do what it says it's going to do?
Yeah. I think it brings up, I remember when my about a year ago, my son's in the military, right? And so there's like defense considerations of like who's making the decision in a military standpoint. There's these decisioning. How far are we going to allow AI to make some of those decisions, and should they? And I think that's where everybody's at. Is this is kind of just, been a year or two where I think everybody's starting to see the benefits and opportunities, some of these larger decisions on how much we rely, how much it's integrated to our day to day. It already is, right? Like I remember just this last week I was speaking at a local university and asked the question, okay, how many of you are using AI every day? And only 30% of the crowd of 150 raised their hand. And I'm like, well, that's not true. All of you are. You just don't even realize it. On a daily basis, if you used a GPS or you ordered food or whatever it is, you are using it in some way. But I think it's some of those security and policy and considerations from all different aspects of our lives of how far are we going to hand off the controls as we go forward.
Yeah, I know that Trina, you're involved in a lot of this training and sort of change management. Maybe say even a little bit more about how that's received.
Yeah. And so I think that moves us to our next slide, and we're getting towards the end here. But some of the challenges in AI adoption, right? Our biggest thing right now is this world is moving fast. We're not adopting as fast as we could or should in some cases. And so there's these skill set gaps. Like I was on a call with a professional development organization yesterday that was asking about how do I bring along this organization that's, maybe in like a construction industry, old school thinking, not tech thinking, right? But this isn't a tech consideration. This is every role has an AI adoption consideration. And really some of the key areas for adopting are sales and marketing teams, right? How to use AI to better understand your clients more. There's application for everyone. And I think everybody's just kind of, not everyone, a large portion of companies just haven't really pushed into, let's just give basic AI expertise training to our organizations, and they'll start to identify and allow the employees to utilize. So that skill set gap, we got to narrow that. And that's what we're doing at Rise Next, is helping to upskill and create these AI transformations from a skill set perspective. And then you have the enterprise or even small businesses, the difficulty in implementing those workflows. What I find in every engagement I have, there are process issues that have to be addressed. There are data issues that have to be addressed. There's leadership development. It's not just, okay, plug and play AI. It is a transformation, and that's why we call it AI transformation training, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then the use case relevance, you can't tackle everything. So what are the most relevant ones? Let's hit those first and then broaden from there. But I mean, I was so glad that you agreed to do this webinar today, because that data sensitivity is what I think is keeping a lot of organizations out. It is complex. I mean, because we've gone through it. I think we've called that out, that it is complex, and being able to lean into this and making sure that we're doing it the right way. And so having consultants like yourself and others help come in to be able to help reduce the concern and making sure that we're adopting in the right ways.
To that end, I think that in the past, of course, we used to talk about things like waterfall as a process. Like you start way at the beginning and then everything kind of trickles down. And then we went with a whole bunch of different versions of how to make that more agile, right? I think part of the problem that we run into with everything that you just said on the slide is that people they kind of want to go back to a waterfall mode for AI, right? Yeah. I don't know if you've noticed that with people you talk to. They feel more comfortable. It's like, let's get all of our data cleaned first. Let's get all of our skill sets figured out. Let's get, they want to accomplish all of those things before beginning, right? What do you tell people like that in that case?
I actually break it down, and we do step change You waterfall doesn't work. Things are changing too quickly, but there's what we find is often really quick wins, right? Of, oh, I didn't realize it could do this. And the mindset shift, and I catch myself doing this as well, of like, instead of asking for the formula on how to do something in a spreadsheet, I'm like, oh, I could just upload the spreadsheet and have it do it. And I think there's a training mindset that has to happen on understanding just the power of the tool to begin with. And then what we do is put together a full strategy and deployment plan of, here's the small changes we're going to do now. Here's the stuff that we want to do that are big lift levers for us, but here's what we need to do to prep to get there. And then we put plans in place from there. But there's always quick wins. I haven't been in an organization yet that hasn't benefited within a day or two. They're always like, oh, I didn't know. Let's go. Right. So I think that you don't overthink it sometimes. Sometimes it can be just a simple thing, and then you start adding in the bigger adoption over time. So let's talk about, as we wrap up here, how can individuals get involved? And this trust topic. How do we get individuals to start establishing trust?
Yeah, I would prefer. So this is clearly my preference. I'm trying to get everybody on board, but I would like to start using the word trust to mean something like social trust. Okay, and not in the past we've left this to mathematicians to figure out what trust means, and so guess what? They came up with a mathematical formula. Right? Normally it's cryptography or something. So I think that we need to start thinking about, as we implement use cases, what do we mean that we trust this agent? What does that mean for us, right? And try to, and that's something that I'm definitely trying to do, establish. Essentially, what I'd like to see is that as an industry, we develop, and that is the organizational AI kind of industry, that we develop our own benchmarks, that we start to say, look, this is what it means to trust an agent. Right? I don't care if it's well on the math test or if it passes, the ARC prize or something. What I care about is, can it do this function properly and consistently, right? And
validate it. I mean, to have like a whole crowdsourced QA test for maybe a simple function, right? And pulling that together.
I like that. Crowdsourced QA test. Yes, exactly.
Yeah, crowdsourced validation for AI. I think there's a lot that can be done in this space. And I love that you've started AI for Society.online. Anybody that wants to get involved, please go to his site and start getting involved in this. Just as a awareness of something I ran across last little while, one of my MIT professors, Thomas Malone, wrote this book called Superminds. And he was talking about this concept of crowdsourcing and how much more powerful it is when a general population will outperform a small group of PhDs. And I think that's the idea, Mike, that I'm seeing come across with this idea of like, well, let's open it up to everybody to be a solution provider or validate or give guidance, and BYOB, right? Like everybody bring their background and experience and perspective.
Coming. Yeah.
Extremely powerful to do that. So look forward to seeing where things go with AI for Society and how we can do that, and just bringing those perspectives together. Just as we wrap up, seeking guidance. I think that's the one thing, not only getting involved, getting trained, learning how to learn in this space, where to go. Both Rise Next and TechVision with Mike and our consulting group are available, and reach out to us. As I just want to make sure everybody understands how incredible this is. Mike has offered to do a 30-minute free consult with him. Like, take advantage of this. It's huge opportunity just to, hey, these things came up in my mind as I was like, what do I need to consider here? Or, give me some basics, engagement. Take advantage of this right now. Hit the QR code. And just don't wait. Like, this is the opportunity and time to lean in and start upskilling and training your organizations in this new way of thinking. We've talked about this mindset shift that's happening. Two other things I want to mention before we kind of wrap it up here. there's a huge opportunity right now. The state of Utah has a custom fit program where they're reimbursing up to 50% of your training fees for an organization. So again, please reach out to us, email me and my team at info@risenext.com and see how we can get in and start helping your organizations kind of rise up to the next level. That's what we're doing. And then the last thing I'll mention, we are doing live events. Our first AI Master Series that will include Mike on the panel is coming up on December 5th. We'll be doing that from 12 to 1:30 at Tax Hive in Orem. You'll be able to find that information on our website, as well as feel free to reach out if you have any questions on that as well. But Mike, it's been such a pleasure to have you on the call and to talk through all of these really complex, challenging things, but hoping that everybody on the call has been able to get a little bit more informed, understand the current landscape a little bit better, and appreciate everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.